Hey, what's going on, guys? Welcome back to another video on my channel, Hairliciously. If you guys are new to the channel, please make sure to subscribe so that you guys are updated on hair loss and hair transplant topics, as well as updates on current hair loss treatments in the pipeline. If you guys are losing hair, make sure to visit my website at hairliciously.com for hair loss treatment solutions backed by science. So today, I have some exciting news to share with you guys all. If you guys recall, I made a video a couple years back regarding an Italian pharmaceutical company called Cassiopeia. It's also now known as Cosmo Pharmaceuticals after they acquired the company back in 2021. And they're anti-androgen topical for the treatment of androgen alopecia. This topical, as most of you guys may know, is called Breezula, aka CB-03-01. Active ingredient clascoterone. And I'll just give you guys a quick recap before I dive into the update for Breezula. One of the main causes of male pattern hair loss is due to high concentrations of DHT in our scalps. DHT is going to shorten the hair follicle's life cycle, and eventually it's going to miniaturize the follicles until they become thinner and thinner. They're no longer going to be able to produce new hair, which results in balding. Now, Breezula is an androgen receptor antagonist that acts directly at the scalp level by blocking DHT's interaction with specific androgen receptors inside the hair follicles. It also reduces the skin's production of prostaglandin D2, which is a hormone that is elevated in balding scalps and is known to inhibit hair growth. Now, one of the biggest advantages of Breezula, unlike FDA-approved medications like finasteride or dutasteride or Minoxidil, is that Breezula is not going to interfere with the hormonal or androgenic profile of patients. And this is going to mean that things like libido and sexual function are going to remain unaffected according to all the clinical trials conducted so far. This is huge because, as many of you guys know, finasteride and dutasteride can cause unwanted sexual side effects, mainly things like low libido and other hormone-related issues, whereas Breezula does not appear to have those systemic side effects based on current data. So a few years back, we did see that phase 2 clinical trials were very successful. And as you guys can see here in these charts, there was a decent amount of improvement to both the hair count and hair width from the 5% and 7.5% concentration formulations twice a day. And the results were nearly comparable to that of finasteride and minoxidil. But do remember that the mechanism of action is going to be different, which means that you are likely to get better efficacy if you stack on these treatments. Moving forward to just a couple days ago, we did receive a press release that Cosmo Pharmaceuticals has released top-line phase 3 clinical trial results for their clascoterone 5% topical solution. The release article is titled Cosmo Announces Breakthrough Phase 3 Top-Line Results from Scalp 1 and Scalp 2 for clascoterone 5% solution in male hair loss, showing up to 539% relative improvement in target area hair count versus placebo. US and European submissions are underway. Now, before I dive into the phase 3 results, I want to address something that's been blowing up online, the claim that Breezula achieved a 539% increase in hair growth. I've seen this number circulating everywhere, and a lot of people are misunderstanding what it actually means. It sounds crazy at first, right? Like Breezula is able to multiply your hair, by 5 times, but that is actually not what it's saying. The 539% figure does not mean that you're going to regrow 500% more hair. It's not going to mean that your hair density is going to increase 5 times. What this number actually represents is a relative improvement compared to placebo inside a very specific measurement zone used in clinical trials. Now, hair loss studies don't measure your entire scalp. They focus on something called target area hair count, which is basically a 1 centimeter circle or square on the scalp. And they take high resolution photos of this tiny area and count the hairs over time after treatment. The 539% improvement simply means that Breezula outperformed placebo by a larger margin within that small target area in one of the phase 3 clinical trials. It is a ratio, not an absolute growth percentage. And here's what's important. The most important part is that the other nearly identical phase 3 study reported a 168% relative improvement. That massive difference alone just shows how unstable these relative ratios can be. They're not averages, and they don't reflect what most users will experience visually. The 539% number is basically the best outcome or statistical outcome from one data set, not something that you should expect in real world use. To really understand what the 539% and 168% numbers really mean, we need to know the actual hair count data, not just the percentages. We need to know exactly how many hairs per centimeter squared grew in the treatment groups, how many grew in the placebo group, what the baseline densities and hair thickness were, and how consistent the results were across the patients. Without the absolute numbers and the before and after images, the percentage improvements are not really going to tell us whether Breezula regrew just a few hairs, a moderate amount of hair, or a clinically meaningful amount of hair. Once they finally do release the full data set of phase 3 clinical trials, will we then be able to judge how strong the phase 3 results really are. So, what does Breezula really do in practical terms? Based on earlier phase 2 clinical data and analysis from researchers and the hair loss community, the realistic expectation seems to be about 10 to 14 additional hairs per centimeter squared. And, that's not going to sound as flashy as 539%, but it's actually similar to what many people get from oral finasteride. And this is a meaningful improvement. It can thicken miniaturized areas, improve coverage, and help your hair look fuller, but it's not going to completely rebuild a lost hairline or give you hair transplant level density on its own. We also have to remember that hair count number, it's not always going to translate into cosmetic results. Two people can have the same increase in hairs per centimeter squared, but look totally different depending on, things like hair diameter, curliness, color contrast, hairstyles, and how diffuse, the thinning is. So 10 to 14 hairs increase per centimeter squared might look dramatic for some and subtle for others. Now, with all that said, Breezula still is a promising new addition to the hair loss treatment landscape, especially for people who cannot tolerate systemic anti-androgens or for those who prefer a topical approach that does not affect hormones. The results so far indicate modest but meaningful thickening, not miracle regrowth, and that's exactly how it should be viewed. Now, the safety profile was also very positive. They're moving quickly with regulatory submissions in both the US and Europe. And the other good news is that they have already secured FDA approval for the 1% clascoterone cream, also known as Winlevi, for the treatment of acne. And since Breezula uses the same active molecule in higher concentrations, I feel like the chances of it successfully progressing through the approval process are significantly improved. Now, some of you guys might also be wondering how Breezula is going to stack up against Pyrilutamide. And from a pharmacological standpoint, Pyrilutamide shows a higher AR binding affinity than clascoterone, suggesting a potentially stronger anti-androgen activity. But it's also important to note that Pyrilutamide does not have FDA approval yet and is still in phase 2 and phase 3 clinical trials, whereas clascoterone has already demonstrated safety profile and earned FDA approval in their 1% formulation. This does give it a regulatory advantage, but I personally still like Pyrilutamide over clascoterone, given that the data shows that it has a higher binding affinity to the AR, meaning that it's a more stronger and effective anti-androgen. But nevertheless, Breezula is still definitely a very promising emerging treatment for androgen alopecia, and it's very likely to be the third ever FDA-approved hair loss treatment in over 25 years and could be a major addition to the treatment arsenal. But that basically wraps up today's video, guys. Let me know in the comments what your thoughts are on Breezula. If it does get approved, would you guys choose Breezula or Pyrilutamide? Let me know in the comments below. And until then, I will talk to you guys in my next video. Take care, guys.